I first want to start off with saying like our values about money might actually be different from yours. And like how we grew up may also be different from yours. And so I think the point is not necessarily like the differences or like, oh, can I relate to that specifically or not, but more so about like how important it is to actually be communicating about money, and thinking about, are you open to being influenced by your partner or the person that you're with or your friends or family, and being changed by each other's values? Are you being honest about your relationship with money? And so we'll kick it off with sharing a little bit about our background, how we grew up, and what are some of the more money stories that we had. And so, um, context on myself, I grew up in like a lower middle class family. And so my parents, both my parents, they worked at the post office. My dad is actually finally retiring this year after like 37 years of like working at the post office. And so, as you can see, they are big believers in stability. They're big believers in consistent income. They're a little more, I think, on the risk um, averse like side, and I think that primarily has to do with the fact that like they needed to be stable in order to raise three kids. So they raised three kids on this like income. Um, and so for me, like growing up, my dad actually really instilled in me the idea that like you do not trust anyone with money. And the reason why that came up is because my grandparents were not the most kind, I think, to my dad, and they took a lot of money. Things were very unfair. I think my dad is the oldest of his family. And so he grew up with a lot of the responsibility of like taking care of the rest of the family, like taking on the pressure of doing that and showing up. And so um, he couldn't really trust, I think, some of his family members. They were very unfair, I think, to him, and lied about certain things. And so when I grew up, there was a lot of like talk, even though I wasn't, when I was really young, I didn't really understand. I just knew that money is uh like, I won't say bad, it's just like nothing is free. Like you cannot believe somebody when they're trying to like be generous or like give you things. And so it makes it very hard, I think, for me to receive things or receive from other people. um I think another story that I had, and this is something that has to do with like my parents, like connection with you know, having a stable income and stuff. Like that was their journey, right? Having stable income allowed them to really raise a family. And so I think there's sort of this um difference between like low risk decisions versus high risk decisions and choices. And so when I grew up, my parents really um, encouraged me to get a stable job, but I decided to go a different route. I became an entrepreneur. And so that's really different. I think they believe in exchanging their time for money, which is very valid. And I think for me, I really see this journey as an investment of my time, in order to see money grow over time. And so there's a little bit of that like mentality that I have. And then with my parents, back in middle school, like I don't know about y'all, if you're familiar with like Hollister and like Abercrombie and Fish, but like that was like all the rage when I was in middle school. And so I just remember going to the like mall and like buying like a jacket that was like $60 or something. And I took it home. I was super excited about it. My mom sees it. She asked me how much it cost. And then her jaw literally dropped. I've never seen her jaw drop like that. And then she like took it back the next day and returned it. And so for me, like it really told me like, oh, partially like, oh, I don't get to have like nice things. I know that that's not what my mom meant, but it's just like, we have to save our money. And I felt like money was very scarce. So I wasn't allowed to like get these like things that feel more like they're coming from joy. And so those are my money stories. I'm gonna pass it over to Kato to share some of his.
Yeah. Yeah. And before I go into mine, I think something I wanted to highlight is that our experiences create these money beliefs in us, and they may not be the most apparent. For example, in Steph's last example, by returning a $60 jacket, that suggested to her that she can't have nice things and that money is scarce. Like it's really multifaceted. And I think it takes a lot of self-awareness and work to really ask yourself questions to really get to the root of like what is this money belief. And fortunately, Steph and I have just been trying to dig at that with each other. And this is someone that you can do with anyone that you feel safe with. It doesn't have to be in relationship with a partner. So I just wanted to say those things before I go into my story. All right, my story. So yeah, like for me growing up, my family, like my mom lended money to different people in the family. Um, she pooled money together with certain family members into real estate because we all have hopes and dreams to, support each other and to strike the gold, but it didn't turn out the way that they hoped it would. And it left a really sour taste in my other family members. And so my mom from a really young age told me that, don't share money. Like when you give money, consider it gone. Just give from a good place. Don't have attachment to it because it's going to create like it can really create some bad tension. So for me, the belief that I started to develop as I grew older is that like money, I really don't want to like give my family money because outside of my mom, because it's just a really dicey thing. And one of the beliefs that I have is that it ruptures family relationships. So that was one of mine. Another one is the classic, like good deals, everyone loves a good deal. I love good deals. Oh my God. Steph can tell you, I can spend 2 hours trying to get, oh, like there's this sale going on last week for Aloe Yoga. Oh my God, the most expensive clothes ever, but I had a free gift card to it. I tried to stack that with Rakuten to get some cash back. And I created all these accounts. And I thought I was hot shit. I was like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get some money back. And I spent like 2 hours on it to like get what, $2? But that's the thing, like it sounds so stupid, but when I find like a good deal and like I do enough research to find it, it almost makes the whole experience so much more enjoyable for me. And that's just me. Um, and so I say that because like, what did that look like growing up? That looked like my family saving tons of napkins, reusing containers, and using money for practical things only, like school and food. And so when I grew up, like my belief became always save money for a rainy day and always try to stretch my money. So that, that was in my orbit as well. And then lastly, there are like societal beliefs that come in there around like norms, around like what a guy should do and what a woman's role should be. And like for me, like there's definitely a belief that's ingrained in me that it's not that strong in me, but it is there. It is very subtle and it's there that I need to be a provider, right? And so I think all these different beliefs that exist contribute to my relationship with money and also my relationship with Steph. So with that, that's just a little bit about like our beliefs. We're gonna now talk to you about like some stories and examples within our relationship.
Okay, so when Kato and I started dating, I remember one of my biggest insecurities was around money, specifically around the way that I have spent it, specifically with pursuing like my personal dreams. And so I remember like the moment I pulled my retirement, like to like invest it into building this organization that I like care about. I remember like, using up all my savings like to try to pursue this dream. And so I knew going into this relationship that it would be something that I have to like talk about. But I remember also feeling a lot of shame because it's just like, oh, like who in their right mind like would pull the retirement. That's what a lot of people told me, like you shouldn't be doing that. But there's also a part of me that was just like, I really care about this thing. I care about building this. I care about the impact that it's going to make. And so like I made that as a personal decision. But I just remember thinking when we are starting to date, like, oh shit, like he kind of needs to know like where I'm at, like because I mean, who knows? Like maybe he will not like appreciate that and like actually disagrees with that. And like if that's gonna be the case, I need to discuss this early on, in case we don't work out, in case it's actually a deal breaker. And so I think one of the principles that I always think about is leaning into like heartbreak over harmony. It's something that we teach in our class, but I think about like, hey, like I'd rather be honest and upfront than like kind of like hide things. And so even though I felt very ashamed and very uncertain and I think fearful of a lot of judgment with Hiro, like I actually like brought it very early on within the first month of our relationship. So
Yeah,
how did you take it?
it was very brave of you to do that. I think I was really love drunk at the beginning of our relationship, you know? Like love trumps everything. But
Was
in all seriousness, right? Like my money stuff is definitely there too. And I did have to set some time just to think a little bit, but it was in the moment. I rationalized that I'm stable. I have a stable job. I'm very fortunate to have that. Steph has a history of taking care of her own expenses. Um, and it's not so much about having like I need my partner to have a certain amount of money, um, six figures or like whatever K that people come up with, like that's not important to me. As long as she was able to take care of herself and that she was pursuing her dreams and that makes her fulfilled, that was really important to me. Um, so that's kind of like what went through my mind at the time. And I said that like, that's fine. Like, I don't see you any differently. Um, yeah, that's kind of how it started out. The one thing I will note is that like we didn't have a conversation around like boundaries and parameters around money. And um, we'll get into that more later in this discussion, but those things change over time. Yeah. Okay. Well, then when you fast forward across the first year, like there was an arc that happened. There are some things that I observed. And one of those things is that Steph was constantly stressed and in survival mode. Like that's the life of the entrepreneur sometimes. And I started to think about like how do I help support her from an abundance mindset perspective when like the money needs can really put her into a place of survival. So yeah, like this is where things started to shift a little bit. And an important story and moment was when I wanted to gift her with some coaching. I wanted to hire a coach to be able to help her out, to prioritize her well-being, and to help her really be able to have abundance in her life, while still pursuing her dream. Um, that did come with a price tag. And I think that's where money stories came up for Steph in terms of like receiving this from me.
Yeah, so I think wow, it's uncomfy even like talking about it.
Mm,
But I
okay.
think like I it's hard, I think, when you are receiving, especially when you grew up like being very hyper independent. Like I think growing up, my parents taught me like, hey, you do not depend on somebody else. They told me like do not depend on a man. They were not the parent that said like marry a rich dude. They literally like told me like you need to figure things out yourself. And so I think there was this like moment in time when Kato had offered, he just saw that like I needed something. He was just trying to like give me something. And I think for me, like it started flaring up a lot of like, okay, like what are you trying to do? Like, is there something you're trying to exchange it for? So remember, like going back to like the money story, like nothing is free, right? So I think there was a lot of disbelief around like, hey, is it possible for somebody to be like this generous? Like this is kind of weird. And then I also felt like if I accepted money, even in this form, like even though it's like through something else, that I am con- I would consider myself like non-independent person and very dependent now. And I think that goes against like my personal like I need to be a self-sufficient person. I cannot depend on somebody else, which is like super ironic because if you think about being in a partnership, like that's kind of the whole point is to be able to sort of be there for each other, support each other when we have the bandwidth or ability to. But I think this was just especially like difficult for me. And I think it also made me feel like kind of made me feel like a problem child. Like I think with my family because I was like that. I was like the middle child. Like I decided to do something else. Both my brothers are doctors, and so like I always felt like this like very like this story that I have is just like I'm a nuisance to my family members. Like I don't deserve the attention. I didn't get a lot of attention. The first child and like the baby of the family get a lot of that. Um, and I was also scared, like, am I by receiving something like this, like, am I letting this person like enable me? Like, am I all of a sudden going to like start depending and wanting like more money? Like there's a lot of like really like big stories for me that were coming up. And at the same time it's like okay, like this person is literally like just trying, like this person has the means to and wants to like support me. Like it literally like in his head was not like that to him. But like I think why I'm highlighting the internal like stories is because even if you're not in this similar situation, I want you to recognize like there's a lot of things that like come up because money can be really charged. And I think what's most important is actually like recognizing what is coming up and then having a conversation about what is coming up. And so Kato and I did have like that conversation around like all these things that I'm like explaining right now. And I think like the win was just around like being able to create the space that we can actually kind of like sift through each and every one of these different stories that were coming up. And that enabled me to then be like, okay, like I'm going to receive and accept like this thing that this person wants to give me and hopefully try not to make a big deal like out of it. But yeah, that's like one of the experiences that was like coming up that like sort of like was charged.
Yeah, good job. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, just want to check in. Before we go on to the next part, I feel like it's important for you all to hear like my side as well, because as I give money, there are stories in my head too. So just like what Steph was talking about around like her feeling like she is dependent on someone else. I also have bits of that too because of my conditioning growing up. But this is why it's important to talk about these things as with whoever you're in a relationship or partnership with or friendship with, because that's how you can start to heal the money stories around it and to be able to move from, in our case, an individualist place to a collectivist place where we're supporting each other. So the act of me giving and gifting was also healing me as well, because I don't even sometimes spend that much on myself. So like it heals me and it also heals her. And we talk about it to be like, all right, what does this mean for each of us? Because at the end of the day, it's like it's the meaning that we place into money, and making sure that you understand like what it's being used for, and like um being honest with each other on like what comes up when you're dealing with things like that. Okay. So the next part I wanted to talk about is like 1 year later. I know I mentioned at the beginning, like I was cool with everything. And then a year later, um, things changed, like things evolved. And I think that the important bit that I want to highlight, that we both want to highlight here, is that it's okay for things to change. It's okay for how we view money and how what our needs are and things like that to change over time. And so at the 1 year mark, something that I was asking Steph of was, instead of reinvesting a lot of the money um, that she made from her business into her business, instead of reinvesting it, can she pay herself out a little bit more so that she can have a little bit more runway? And so that was kind of just what I put out there. And look, like that was even hard for me to say. Okay, because like she is her own boss, she is her own, she runs her company, she makes her decisions. I am not like in those operations. So for me to say that, I think I felt tension between like I don't want to ruffle feathers, but again, going back to the heartbreak over the harmony and talking about like, I can state my opinion on what I think that is going to like create more abundance for her and more sustainability for her. I went ahead and said that. And so, we started to talk from there. Um how do we shift? How do we make that happen? And that was basically like the gist of it. So I think there's a bit here around like money uh, is very human, like that's kind of like our take on it. And sometimes you can really get lost in it, and it prevents you from being present with the other person. Um, and so these conversations are really important because while money is not everything, it's necessary. And just having the conversation will surface a bunch of this other stuff. And it's really important to understand where those stories come from. Um, and if we didn't seek to take the steps to understand the stories, the millions of stories, the numerous stories beneath why we were saying certain things, like we wouldn't be able to look at each other in a compassionate way. And instead that might have exploded into some defensiveness, or like getting in fights and stuff like that. um, I would say that money conversations aren't necessarily easy. Like there definitely was tension that came up between us. Um, but like it's always worthwhile, because you always, if you make the effort, you will be able to find a way to understand the other person.
Yeah, I think um I wanted to share a little bit about what it was like when Cato brought up the conversation. And because I think money is sensitive to a person who literally is putting everything on the line. So it's just like it doesn't go over my head that this is something that's like really important. And I think that like when he surfaced it, I just remember feeling like initially it was just like, wait, but didn't you say like it was like okay beforehand? Like what changed? And there was like a defensiveness that I think like came up, like why are you switching, like what you said, like were you being dishonest, were you withholding, like and those things I think can be natural to come up when you we're told something different from before. And so that's why we want to highlight the fact that like things can shift. But I also think what's important to highlight is like when he did bring this up, like I saw an opportunity to see like, oh, what does this person like actually like value? Right. And I think that there's when we have conversations, sometimes it's not about like solving the problem that we like have initially. It's actually to just understand like where this person is coming from, why it's coming up, what it took for them to have this conversation to begin with. And all those things I think are just important things to consider, like when we're going into this, going to conversations about very charged things. And so I think what I appreciated about Cato bring this up, even though it's like changed or shifted from what he initially talked about, was just like, what it took to actually bring that up, and recognizing that, there are needs that he like has within the relationship, and like, I'm not necessarily meeting them with the way that I'm operating. Right. And so it takes, um, you know, you recognizing like, hey, there's something that's like not working for me, and actually like surfacing it and taking the risk. And that's what we're really honing in on, because it doesn't matter necessarily like what situation that you're in. Every one of our situations with money like will be different, but I think it's really about like how are you having the conversations, and like what are you both like walking away from that, and is there more clarity for that. And like those things are, I think, important wins as we are going about it, not just like the solution itself, but just recognizing like, hey, like us coming together to even have this difficult conversation is something like worth celebrating. And so really wanting to highlight that too, because again, money is just one of the topics that like can get charged like in a conversation. But yeah, Kato and I actually ended up spending like our entire vacation time together, like talking about this. So I'm not saying that like, I know we talk about it in the aftermath and post processing, but this stuff it takes a lot of time and a lot of energy. And it's so important to honor the space that it needs, and honor the space that both parties need in order to feel safe to actually like converse about this. And so yeah, I just wanted to surface that. Kato, anything else you want to add?
I think the last thing I wanted to say is that I think people can view money as a very black and white thing, in the extremes. Like there's a culture that encourages us to build wealth in America. Then there's our family that encourages us to be stable. And then there's societal pressures that say, get yourself nice things, or like live, here's how to live a great life. Um, Travel a lot, or like, I don't know, like there's all these things that are telling us what makes a good life. And money is the enabler for a lot of those things. And so I think because there's so many different things coming at us, that's what makes money hard sometimes to talk about. And so I think I just leave this last bit with saying that like these conversations are worth having. Um, they're definitely not easy, but finding the ways and the skills to be able to have them and to validate each other, um, will help you with the next step. Because yeah, it's everyone has a different story, different upbringing, and when you bring two people together in a relationship, um, then you're gonna figure out what that combo does. So